Good evening. This is Isabella from United News Network. Today, I am presenting Top 10 U.S. News. Here is the headlines for Top 10 News. Today 1. Supreme Court term reshapes presidential power and independent federal agencies. 2. House Republicans voter ID push stalls defense legislation before the July 4th recess. 3. Supreme Court decisions on birthright citizenship, voting rights, and immigration. 4. The Supreme Court's growing use of emergency rulings, known as the shadow docket. 5. President Trump's July 4th America 250 message and the politics of national identity. 6. The future of the Federal Trade Commission after the court's agency power ruling. 7. Amy Coney Barrett's role in the Supreme Court's most consequential term. 8. The political consequences of the House leaving Washington early. 9. The White House push for a new federal election law. Package 10. How the Supreme Court's 2026 term is changing the balance of power in Washington. Now I will start the full details of all the news, so stay tuned with me. First topic: Supreme Court term reshapes presidential power and independent federal agencies. The U.S. Supreme Court's latest term has delivered a major shift in the balance of power between the White House and independent federal agencies. In a ruling involving the Federal Trade Commission, the court backed President Donald Trump's removal of Democratic FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter. The decision has been widely viewed as a significant expansion of presidential authority over agencies that Congress designed to operate with a degree of independence from day-to-day political control. The FTC is responsible for enforcing consumer protection and antitrust laws. Its commissioners traditionally serve fixed terms, and federal law has sought to limit a president's ability to remove them without cause. But the court's decision signals that those protections may now be more vulnerable. Supporters of the ruling argue that voters elect a president to run the executive branch and that agencies exercising substantial federal power should be accountable to the elected president. Critics say the decision could weaken the independence of regulators and make enforcement priorities more vulnerable to political change. The court did preserve the Federal Reserve's special status in a separate dispute involving Governor Lisa Cook. That distinction suggests the justices may treat some agencies differently because of their constitutional role or historical structure. The immediate impact could reach far beyond the FTC. Legal experts say the ruling may affect agencies responsible for labor policy, consumer finance, communications, and other areas of federal regulation. Congress could respond with legislation, but any major change would require bipartisan agreement. The larger question is whether this marks a lasting redefinition of the modern administrative state. The answer may depend on future cases, future presidents, and whether Congress chooses to rewrite the laws governing independent agencies. Second topic: House Republicans voter ID push stalls defense legislation before the July 4th recess. A fight inside the Republican-controlled House has delayed work on a major defense policy bill and exposed divisions within the party ahead of the midterm elections. A group of Republican hardliners blocked progress on the annual National Defense Authorization Act, demanding that House leaders attach the Save America Act to the measure. The election bill would require proof of U.S. citizenship and voter identification for federal elections. The defense bill is one of Congress's most important annual measures. It sets policy for the military and often includes provisions affecting defense spending, military personnel, procurement, and national security priorities. Supporters of the voter ID proposal say it would protect election integrity and ensure that only eligible citizens vote in federal elections. Democrats and voting rights advocates argue that existing laws already prohibit non-citizen voting and that documentation requirements could create barriers for eligible voters who do not have easy access to the required records. The dispute became serious enough that House leaders sent members home 2 days early for the July 4th recess. Speaker Mike Johnson is working with a narrow majority, making it difficult to move major legislation when even a small number of members withhold support. The Senate faces a separate challenge. Even if the House advances the election measure, it would likely need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster in the Senate, where bipartisan support may be difficult to secure. When lawmakers return, House leaders will need to decide whether to separate the defense bill from the election fight or seek another compromise. The episode is a reminder that internal party divisions can shape the national legislative agenda as much as disagreements between Republicans and Democrats. Reuters 3. Third topic: Supreme Court decisions on birthright citizenship, voting rights, and immigration. The Supreme Court's final decisions of the term have placed citizenship, elections, and immigration at the center of the country's political and legal debate. One of the term's most significant rulings rejected President Trump's effort to restrict birthright citizenship through executive action. The court ruled that the 14th Amendment protects citizenship for people born in the United States who are subject to its jurisdiction, reaffirming a long-standing constitutional interpretation. The decision was a major setback for the administration's immigration agenda. Supporters of the president's position had argued that the Constitution should be interpreted more narrowly. Opponents said changing birthright citizenship by executive order would conflict with both constitutional text and Supreme Court precedent. At the same time, the court has issued other immigration-related rulings that have generally given the administration greater latitude in pursuing restrictive policies. That combination has created a complicated picture. The court placed a clear limit on one major presidential initiative while supporting executive authority in other areas. Voting rights also remain a major legal and political issue. Cases involving election rules, district maps, and federal oversight continue to shape how states conduct elections and how voters are represented. The consequences may be especially important as the country approaches the 2026 midterms. For families, state election officials, and immigration advocates, the rulings have immediate practical effects. For lawmakers, they raise a broader question: which issues should be resolved by Congress, and which can be decided by presidents, states, or courts? The court's term may be over, but its decisions will continue to influence the next election cycle and the national debate over the meaning of citizenship and political representation. Fourth topic: the Supreme Court's growing use of emergency rulings, known as the shadow docket. The Supreme Court is facing renewed scrutiny over its use of emergency orders, often called the shadow docket. These rulings are issued outside the court's traditional process of full briefing, oral argument, and lengthy written opinions. Emergency orders can be necessary when the court believes immediate action is required, but critics say their growing use in major policy disputes can make the court's reasoning harder for the public and lower courts to understand. This term, the emergency docket has played an important role in disputes involving presidential authority, federal agencies, immigration, election law, and social policy. In one closely watched order, the court protected Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook from removal while the legal dispute continued. Supporters of the court's approach say emergency rulings are a practical tool for preventing immediate harm while lower court cases move forward. They argue that the court must sometimes act quickly when a federal policy is blocked or when a constitutional dispute affects the country nationwide. Critics, including some legal scholars and advocates, say the process can allow major legal changes without the transparency normally expected from the nation's highest court. They worry that short orders can leave lower courts uncertain about how to apply the law. The issue has also created divisions among the justices. Some have called for clearer explanations, while others have emphasized the need for judicial restraint and speed in urgent cases. The debate is likely to continue because emergency requests are now a regular part of major political and legal conflicts. The question is not whether the court will use the emergency docket, but how often it should use it and how much explanation the public should receive. Fifth topic: President Trump's July 4th America 250 message and the politics of national identity. America's 250th Independence Day has become both a national celebration and a moment of political reflection. President Trump issued an official proclamation declaring July 4, 2026, the 250th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. The proclamation called on Americans to observe the milestone with ceremonies recognizing the country's history and accomplishments. The anniversary, often called the semi-quincentennial, is being marked across the country with parades, public events, historical programs, and commemorations. It is also prompting broader conversations about national identity, patriotism, immigration, democracy, and the country's unfinished struggles. Supporters of the administration's approach say the anniversary is an opportunity to emphasize shared civic traditions and national unity. Critics argue that public celebrations should also acknowledge the complexity of American history, including the experiences of groups whose rights and opportunities were denied or limited at different points in the country's past. Those differences are not new. National anniversaries often bring competing views about what should be celebrated, remembered, and changed. But the debate carries particular weight in an election year, as political leaders seek to connect their policy agendas to larger ideas about the nation's future. The White House has made the 250th anniversary a central public theme through its Freedom 250 initiative. State and local governments, schools, museums, and civic organizations are also planning events that reflect their own communities and histories. For many Americans, July 4th remains a personal holiday centered on family, community, and tradition. For the country's political leaders, it is also a reminder that the meaning of American identity remains a continuing national conversation. Sixth topic: the future of the Federal Trade Commission after the court's agency power ruling. The future of the Federal Trade Commission is now in sharper focus after the Supreme Court's ruling supporting President Trump's removal of an FTC commissioner. The FTC plays a major role in the U.S. economy. It investigates alleged unfair business practices, enforces consumer protection laws, and challenges mergers that it believes could reduce competition. Its decisions can affect technology companies, healthcare providers, retailers, pharmaceutical firms, and consumers nationwide. For decades, the agency's structure was intended to give it some independence. Commissioners serve fixed terms, and the commission includes members from both political parties. The goal was to prevent sudden political shifts from completely changing regulatory policy. The court's ruling could alter that balance. If presidents have greater authority to remove commissioners, they may be able to shape the agency more directly and more quickly. That could lead to changes in how aggressively the FTC pursues antitrust cases, regulates technology companies, or enforces consumer rules. Supporters say stronger presidential control improves democratic accountability. They argue that executive agencies should answer to the president voters elect. Critics say the change could weaken the agency's ability to make decisions based on long-term economic and legal considerations rather than short-term political pressure. They also warn that businesses could face greater uncertainty if enforcement priorities shift sharply from one administration to the next. The FTC itself will continue operating, but its legal and institutional role may be changing. Future court cases and congressional action could determine whether the ruling remains limited to the FTC or becomes a broader model for federal agencies across Washington. Seventh topic: Amy Coney Barrett's role in the Supreme Court's most consequential term. Justice. Amy Coney Barrett emerged as one of the most closely watched members of the Supreme Court during its latest term. Barrett is part of the court's conservative majority, but her voting record this term showed that her role cannot always be reduced to a simple political label. In several major cases, she joined conservative outcomes. In others, she sided with the court's liberal justices or joined decisions that limited parts of the Trump administration's agenda. Her role was especially important in the birthright citizenship case, where the court rejected the president's effort to limit citizenship through executive action. The decision showed that even in a term that produced significant wins for presidential power and conservative legal arguments, the administration did not prevail in every major dispute. Legal analysts often describe Barrett as a justice who pays close attention to legal text, precedent, and the specific facts of a case. That approach can produce results that satisfy conservative legal principles while still differing from the immediate preferences of a Republican administration. Her influence matters because the court remains closely divided in some high-profile cases. When justices move across expected ideological lines, they can shape the outcome and the scope of the court's reasoning. Barrett's decisions will continue to be examined as the court considers future disputes involving executive power, immigration, election rules, religious liberty, and federal regulation. The broader lesson from this term is that Supreme Court outcomes are not always predictable from political affiliation alone. The justices' legal approaches, the facts of individual cases, and the limits of constitutional power can all determine the result. Eighth topic: the political consequences of the House leaving Washington early. The House of Representatives left Washington early before the July 4th recess after a dispute over election legislation blocked progress on a major defense bill. The immediate issue was the National Defense Authorization Act, an annual measure that guides military policy and spending. A group of Republican hardliners refused to allow the bill to move forward unless leaders attached the Save America Act, which would add federal voter ID and proof of citizenship requirements. The result was an early adjournment and a public display of the challenges facing Speaker Mike Johnson. With a narrow Republican majority, the Speaker has limited room for defections. A small group of members can delay legislation, demand changes, or force leaders to choose between competing factions. For Republicans, the conflict may energize voters who want stronger federal election rules, but it also risks delaying work on defense, spending, and other priorities that party leaders want to complete before the midterm elections. For Democrats, the dispute provides an opportunity to argue that House Republicans are allowing internal disagreements to interfere with core government responsibilities. Democrats oppose the voter ID proposal, saying it could burden eligible voters and that non-citizen voting is already illegal. The political consequences could extend beyond the July 4th recess. The House will return with a crowded agenda, including defense policy, appropriations, and election-related debates. If party divisions continue, leadership may need to rely on procedural compromises or, in some cases, Democratic votes to move legislation. The episode shows how a narrow majority can make Congress less predictable. It also underscores how election policy has become central to broader fights over governing, party unity, and control of the House in 2026. Ninth topic: the White House push for a new federal election law package. The White House and congressional Republicans are continuing to promote the Save America Act, a federal election law proposal centered on voter identification and proof of citizenship. Supporters say the bill would strengthen confidence in elections by requiring people registering to vote in federal elections to provide documents proving U.S. citizenship. They argue that these requirements are common-sense safeguards and that voting should be limited to eligible citizens. Opponents say federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections. They argue that additional documentation requirements could make registration more difficult for eligible citizens, including people whose names have changed, people without passports, and those who face challenges obtaining birth certificates or other records. The House approved a version of the proposal earlier this year, but its prospects in the Senate remain uncertain. Most major legislation in the Senate needs 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, meaning Republican support alone may not be enough. The debate has become a central political issue because it combines questions about election administration, federalism, immigration, and public trust. States have traditionally played the largest role in running elections, while Congress has authority to set certain federal election rules. The White House argues that national standards are needed. Critics say the proposal could impose a one-size-fits-all system and create new barriers to participation. The next steps will depend on whether congressional leaders can find a path through the Senate and whether the measure remains tied to other legislation, including defense bills. Regardless of its immediate legislative future, the proposal is likely to remain part of the 2026 campaign debate. 10th topic: how the Supreme Court's 2026 term is changing the balance of power in Washington. The Supreme Court's 2026 term may be remembered as a defining moment in the struggle over power in Washington. The court issued decisions that strengthened presidential authority in some areas, particularly over independent agencies. It also delivered major rulings on immigration, elections, and other issues that are likely to shape national policy long after this term ends. The most significant shift came in the court's decision involving the Federal Trade Commission. By supporting the president's removal of an FTC commissioner, the court opened the door to greater White House influence over agencies that Congress had structured to operate with some independence. At the same time, the court imposed limits on presidential power in the birthright citizenship case. The justices rejected an attempt to narrow constitutional citizenship protections through executive action, showing that the court is not giving the administration unlimited authority. Congress remains central to this balance, but lawmakers face their own challenges. Deep partisan divisions and narrow majorities can make it difficult to pass legislation that clarifies federal power or responds to Supreme Court decisions. The result is a system in which the presidency and the courts may have more influence over national policy, while Congress struggles to build the coalitions needed for major action. Supporters of the court's direction say it restores constitutional accountability by ensuring that executive power is exercised by officials answerable to voters. Critics say it risks concentrating too much power in the presidency and judiciary at the expense of Congress and independent institutions. The practical effects will unfold over time. Federal agencies may change how they operate. Presidents may test the new boundaries of their authority. And Congress may face growing pressure to decide whether it wants to reclaim more control over the laws and institutions it created. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Thank you for your support. Have a nice day, everyone.